Hi and welcome back to the Nook. Do you like that new greeting? I just thought that maybe I should do something a little bit more consistent. And since this channel is called A Netty Nook, I thought I should just say welcome to the Nook as a kind of greeting. Anyway, today's video is going to be about a book haul. Now, I am not someone who would advocate for mindless consumerism, so I just want to preface this video by saying that I did accumulate these books over a period of time, probably over the past 6 months. And the reason why I wanted to do a specific book haul for this video, which is going to be Singaporean books, is because I generally feel like there aren't a lot of book hauls that are specific to Singaporean books or Singaporean literature. And I just wanted to compile all of them in this video so that you can kind of get a sense of what books are out there and some more interesting nonfiction titles, because I do tend to read nonfiction, as well as some interesting literature that you can check out as well. So today's video is gonna be a book haul of all the Singapore related books that I've gotten over the past few months. As you can tell, like, this is my singlet shelf. This is kind of like my everything that's got to do with Singapore is on this shelf, and it's really full right now. I don't know what I'm gonna do once I cannot even fit the books on the top, but we'll figure that out later. I might actually just put them up for fundraisers and things like that. So let's just get on to the video. Yeah. So first, let's start with the big boy. This is Exhale, an anthology of queer Singapore voices. This was super recently published, just last month. It's kind of like a follow-up sequel to Gasp, which is a gay anthology of Singapore poetry and prose. I think that was published back in 2010, whereas this was published just this year in 2021. It's sort of like the 10th year anniversary, kind of a commemoration of how far LGBTQ rights have kind of progressed. I mean, it hasn't really progressed, but there's been a lot of consciousness raising that has happened over the past decade, which I think can be sort of seen in this collection as well. So really thick book. It's published by the Math Paper Press, which is the in-house publishing house for Books Actually, which is an independent bookstore here in Singapore. So I'm really excited to get into this. I kind of read the preface as well as a few of the poems inside it, and I really enjoyed it so far. I think this will definitely become like a comfort read for me, so that's that. Next is this book that I got as part of a mutual aid fundraising effort, and that's The Sound of Sch by Danielle Lim. It's a memoir-ish kind of situation about the experience of having a loved one struggle with schizophrenia, and kind of having this context of 1960s Singapore up to the 1990s, about how Singapore has been globalizing, that sort of slice of life situation in this rapidly globalizing society, which I think would be very interesting to read. I haven't really gotten to reading it, but I do think that this book is really touted by a lot of people as like a really good read in terms of mental health and in terms of like the state of society and progression, development in modernizing Singapore. So that's this book. Do check it out if you're interested in those themes. This doesn't really count as like a book, but it is published by a local playwright, Myle Yan Tay. He wrote this 2 short like graphic novels. I mean, it's really tiny. I mean, it's a really short story. It's illustrated by Shuxian Lee, Shuxian, and it's 2 stories published by Checkpoint Theatre. I bought it initially just to kind of support the whole efforts of Checkpoint Theatre, but I really enjoyed the stories. It's very simple. It's kind of like a pass me down sort of family story. I really find like the stories are super very much reminiscent of the kinds of things that maybe your grandparents would tell you, which give you this kind of cozy vibe as well. And I really love how it's a very localized production, like publication. So this is kind of like a one-off thing. Usually they will be putting up performances and writing plays. So I really like the fact that they branched out to actually engaging illustrators to do these short stories. So that's pretty interesting. I don't know whether they still sell these on their website, but I'll link it down below if they do. The next book I have here is The Complete Works of Kuo Pao Kun. I actually got this off Carousel secondhand from, I think, a student, like an art student. And Kuo Pao Kun is one of the, I guess, pioneer playwrights in Singapore. I've personally never studied his works before, but while I was trying to understand a little bit more about the art history of Singapore, his name came up a lot, and his quotes have been always cited by other art makers in Singapore, especially people who kind of dedicate a lot of time and energy to building up the art scene. So I was very interested, why are they all citing this guy, and what about his plays address really quintessential Singaporean dilemmas and identity. I think it's really, really interesting. I think he's also the founder of the Substation in Singapore, which is an independent art space, but unfortunately they're facing a lot of issues now. Don't know whether they're gonna still be operating, but generally there's a lot of tension around independent arts in Singapore. A lot of issues of what is permissible in the art spaces, and I just wanted to take on the personal challenge of reading some of his original works, because even though he's well known for being an art advocate, I wanted to also understand his kind of theatrical practice as well. But I'm definitely not someone that's trained in playwriting or in studying plays, so it'll be an interesting challenge for me to kind of dive deeper into this. Kuo Pao Kun actually did plays in multiple languages, not just in English, so that's a really interesting point as well. Next, I have this amazing book. I don't know whether this will ever land me in any sort of red zone here in Singapore, but I mean, it's a book. This is 1987, Singapore's Marxist Conspiracy 30 Years On, the Solidarity edition that was published in support of Jolovan Wam. If you don't know anything about this whole situation, I'm going to link down resources that you can read to learn about the situation. And yeah, I bought this book mostly to support the activists in question, but I was also really, really interested in understanding more about this particular incident. And it's a really, really important moment in Singapore's history that a lot of people don't know about, and it's not being taught in state education, definitely not taught in social studies in Singapore, and there's still a lot of tension around ideology in Singapore politics, and I think this is true of any other country, but definitely there is a lot of conflict around Singapore's history, and that's why a lot of things that are political in writing in Singapore tend to also deal with a lot of historical facts and historical retellings. Singapore does have this thing with collective amnesia, which I think is very, very common in a lot of post-colonial countries. So this is definitely a book that you'll have to pick up if you're interested in understanding the ideological, historical, political backgrounds of Singapore, especially with regards to dissident politics in some ways. So this is definitely a book that's super important in that strand of thinking, thought, activism, etc. The next book I have here is Mobilizing Gay Singapore, Rights and Resistance in an Authoritarian State by Lynette J. Chua. So Lynette J. Chua is writing this from a very legal perspective, so I'm suspecting that there's going to be a lot of legal maneuvering in this book, but it is extremely important. In Singapore, activism is usually centered around legal practices, around what is considered legal, what is considered criminal. A lot of it is kind of navigating the sort of in and outs of a very paternalistic, to some extent, state. This is of course really dependent on how you would interpret and analyze Singapore's political kind of structure, but definitely a lot of activism here is not as what you might see in other countries where people might go out and onto the streets and protest and people have this very direct action. A lot of the work in Singapore is a lot more indirect and a lot more slow, accumulative. And so if you want to know more about gay rights in Singapore, or the LGBTQ community and activism in Singapore, this is pretty important nonfiction to pick up. If you want to know more about the nitty-gritties of that context in Singapore. If not, I do think that the Anthology Exhale would be a good version to kind of juxtapose more of the lived experiences and stories of people. But this is definitely more for an academic and I guess a lot more of the structural understanding of issues here in Singapore. So this is the book that you would have to check out for that. Next, I have a bunch of history books. I am not a history student. I study anthropology, but history and anthropology have always been very deeply intertwined. So I'm not gonna pretend that there are very strict delineations between the two subjects. But yeah, the first book I have here is a very specific niche book, and it's The Indonesian Revolution and the Singapore Connection, 1945 to 1949 by Yong Mun Chong. As you might know or you might not know, I have connections to Indonesia as my family kind of migrated from there. And I was very, very interested in studying about Indonesian post-colonial history. And I sort of vaguely know that there are some connections between Singapore's past and Indonesia's past, but I've never really gotten into it. So this is the book that I specifically picked up for that reason alone. I don't know how interesting it will be, but I'll update you if I ever get around to reading this book. And the next book is not specific to Singapore, but it is about Southeast Asia, Locating Southeast Asia, Geographies of Knowledge and Politics of Space. Instead of this book, I'm going to be recommending this book called Singapore in the Malay World by Zubaidah Rahim, I think. It's a really, really good book that I'm reading now, and it specifically talks about Singapore and its neighbours that are Malay kind of dominated. So it's basically Singapore and the Malay world, how it grapples with politics and the history between its two neighbours of Malaysia and Indonesia. I think it's an excellent book. I would recommend it highly to read. And yeah, the full title is down in the description box below. The last book that I want to talk about is Paths Not Taken, Political Pluralism in a Post-War Singapore. This is edited by two editors, and I've heard about this book somewhere in different places. I chose this book to read simply because I wanted to dispel the myths of this like one-party rule that is kind of common in our narratives. And you might be watching and wondering why I am choosing so many books that are very niche, and that's because I want to deliberately kind of expand my understanding of Singapore's history beyond what is commonly talked about in mass media or in state narratives. And some people might be like, why don't you have any books about PAP or Lee Kuan Yew? And that's because I sort of already have been surrounded by media about them ever since young, so it doesn't really make sense to just kind of surround myself even more with books about them. Rather, I just wanted to expand the sort of reading diet that I have about Singapore beyond the state media, right? Which obviously would incline towards certain perspectives a little bit more. Now, moving on, I have this ethnography book, which is pretty random. It's called Sonic City, Making Rock Music and Urban Life in Singapore by Steve Ferzacca. Not sure how to pronounce that, but it's an ethnography, and I was pretty excited to pick this up because, I've not really seen a lot of ethnographies about urban culture in Singapore, so I haven't really seen any sort of like full-length ethnographies about culture making, exactly, like especially vernacular culture making with regards to music and dance. And so, my own senior thesis was about dance, and I felt that this was pretty similar, but it's about music instead. So I really wanted to see how the ethnography worked out. This is really like a personal interest, so I don't expect it to be interesting to you all, but really rock music as a genre, I would really love to see how it plays out in an urban setting like Singapore, where there's a lot of misconceptions about how uptight people are here, or about how our entertainment scene is not so developed. So I'll be really interested to see how people actually do take charge of the genre and have these sort of vernacular communities around music. So that's the book right here. So the last few books that I have in this book haul are a bit more on the literary and artistic side, I guess. The first book I want to talk about is a poetry collection called Parsetreeforestfire. What am I saying? Parsetreeforestfire by Hamid Roslan. This is a local poet, and I mean, I guess local writer, and it's a really, really witty, smart take on the Singaporean kind of, how do I say, colloquial language, Singlish. And you know, if you don't know Singlish already, I don't really speak a lot of Singlish on this channel because it's kind of weird to be speaking Singlish to a camera because the camera is not a person. But I do speak Singlish colloquially with friends and acquaintances and family. And there's so much kind of there's so many misconceptions or stereotypes about Singlish, but I do think Singlish is a very interesting mix of all its cultures and all its linguistic histories. Definitely it varies from person to person. There is no definite definition of what Singlish actually is or what it sounds like or what the grammatical rules are, but this was a really, really smart take on Singlish, and I really, really love how witty the entire collection is. I really love reading this work, and I definitely will be reading more stuff by Hamid Roslan in the future. Definitely very easy to get through, and it's just something that I think you will go back to often to sort of bask in the simplicity but also the beauty of Singlish as a colloquial language. It's kind of like getting an inside joke, you know. But if you're someone that really loves linguistics and you will also love to pick up a piece of local Singapore literature, I would really recommend this book. Next, I have two books by the same author, Amanda Lee Cole. This is Ministry of Moral Panic. This is her first published short story collection, as well as this book, The Late Rays of a Star, which is her first full-length novel. This is a historical fiction, whereas this is more of like a collection of short stories that blend kind of realistic but also fantastical retellings of Singaporean icons and stories. I really, really enjoyed this book. This is my second edition copy because I lost my first edition, more like I lent it to a friend but she never returned it. So I really wanted to reread the book and I got myself another copy. Whereas so this was thrifted. I got this because I really enjoyed the first book, so I wanted to see how her full-length novel would actually pan out. And I also am a sucker for historical fiction, so I thought this would be a really great next pick for a fiction title that I should complete sometime soon. I'm not sure whether you watched my previous video, but I did finish reading The Minorities by Sufyan Hakim, and I loved it so much, and I realized that I've been severely missing out when it comes to local literature in terms of like novels. I've only really been reading poetry and short story collections, but I definitely want to be expanding more in the novel category. Now, the very, very last book for this video is called The Boring Donkey Songs, and I got this at the Singapore Art Book Fair, and it's by Lee Wen, who is a Singaporean artist, very well known for his takes on cultural identity here in Singapore. If you're from here, or like if you're sort of Singaporean, or you kind of know a little bit more about the Singaporean art scene, you might know him as the person who interrogates a lot about what it means to be Chinese in Singapore, really about the cultural identity of being Chinese in Singapore. And so this, he's more of a performance artist or installation art artist, but this is a collection of all his ramblings and poetry. So far it reads more like diary entries, and it reads more like really random reflections over his career of art making. So it's edited by Jason Wee, kind of put together as a overview of his artistic journey over the years, which I am really, really enjoying because I haven't really had the opportunity to be up close to his artwork, which I would love to know more about. So getting to know him through a more literary work was really, really interesting, because you don't get that opportunity very often. You don't really get to see the inner workings of a lot of performance artists in a more intimate way. So this has been a really interesting read for me. Oh wait, I have one last book, and that's Liberalism, Disavowed by Chua Huat. This is, I'm sort of like reading the first chapter now. It's a really dense book. It's really about politics. If you're a politics buff, you would superbly enjoy this book. Definitely not easy reading. If you're looking for like a critique that doesn't hold back, you can really definitely pick up this book, because Chua Huat is really well known as someone who analyzes and critiques Singapore's political ideologies very well, and I know a lot of people really recommend this book as well, so cool. So yeah, that's about it for this video. I know I went through the books really fast because I didn't want to bore you guys too much with just going through the books. I'm gonna add down below the list of books I have as ebooks as well, because these are all the physical copies I have, but I will also add some of the books that I managed to get as digital copies. So yeah, I hope this list of books have been helpful for you. Chances are you're probably like a non-Singaporean viewer, so I hope that watching this video kind of gives you a better sense of what books you might want to pick up about Singapore, politics and history. Now, you know, beyond the usual PAP or Lee Kuan Yew memoirs that tend to dominate the charts if you search up books about Singapore. Now, I know that a lot of media tends to portray Singapore as a very highly advanced and very, very successful country and society. And I would like to say that yes, I do think that Singapore does have its successes, that it should have, you know, proper credit when it's due. But I also want to put a disclaimer that with every society and with every sort of country, there are limits, and there are also some issues that tend to be glossed over, compromised in favor of other pursuits. So that would include certain civic liberties here in Singapore. It would also include certain artistic expressions or certain nuclear family structures or any sort of anomalies, what is considered normative, I guess, in Singapore. So I hope to encourage you to keep those things in mind if you do pick up books about Singapore in the future, that, you know, no country is simple. Every country has its own nuance, and I really sincerely hope that you'll pick up a more interesting book about Singapore other than what is commonly portrayed out there in the media. And if you are a Singaporean viewer, thanks so much for watching this video all the way through. I hope that there's a book here that sort of piques your interest, that's a little bit different from what you might also see in the public libraries, or what you might see being touted around as like essential reading for Singapore. Yeah, and other than that, I don't really have much to say. I'm not going to be filming a lot of book hauls. I honestly only film them once in a few months, so don't expect too many book hauls from me. It's really more of sharing resources and titles that I'll be more interested in. I will also be expanding a little bit more in terms of my content. I know that a lot of you love the sit down and talk videos, but I also would love to expand more into vlogging style videos as well as topics on other issues. So yeah, thanks so much for joining me today. I hope you're having a good day. If not, I do hope that you'll have a lovely evening tonight, that you get to rest well with your loved ones. And I hope that tomorrow will treat you much better than today, even if it might not seem like it. I also want to thank you so much for staying with me till the end of the video. If you liked it, don't forget to comment or subscribe, or to share this video with friends. And I'll see you in the next video. Thanks so much, and I'll see you